Welcome to Deep Story. Now, here's something wild. Back in 1921, Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, took a trip to China. And when he got back, he wrote this hilarious observation about the country's warlord battles. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, these wars are unique because neither side actually wants to fight. Both sides just want to run away. Victory goes to whoever figures out first that the other side is retreating. I mean, Seaman, how ridiculous does that sound? But then you think about it and you're like, wait, hold on. This actually makes sense. Think about what happened after the Qing dynasty fell. China descends into this chaotic era of warlord infighting. Skirmishes here, scuffles there, battles everywhere. Even after Chiang Kai shek comes into the picture, you get things like the Central Plains War. But seriously, have you ever heard of one of these battles being described as absolutely catastrophic? Thousands dead, rivers of blood. Nope, right? And why? Because these guys weren't fighting over deep, seated grudges or grand ideologies. They were basically guys who signed up for a meal ticket, serving under commanders who just wanted more land. Who's dying for that? It's like these wars had some unspoken rules. You show up, fire a few shots, and hope nobody gets too enthusiastic. And that worked for them. But let's put that aside for a minute and hop across the Pacific, where just a few decades earlier another civil war was raging. And this one, oh boy, this one makes the Chinese warlord skirmishes look like a neighborhood water balloon fight. Let me hit you with a number: 620,000. That's how many people died in the American Civil War. 620,000. You know what that number means. It's more than all US deaths in World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam combined. That's not just brutal, that's a bloodbath. And here's the thing: this wasn't a war between two groups that absolutely hated each other on a personal level. So, what the hell happened? Why did they go all out like this? To answer that, we have to dig into slavery. Yeah, I know, not exactly a topic that gets people laughing, but stick with me, because here's the thing: this isn't a tough moral puzzle. Slavery is wrong. Full stop. This isn't just an American thing either, it's universal. Even Confucius, thousands of years ago, was out there saying, do not do to others what you wouldn't want done to yourself. And yet, America's founding fathers, Washington, Jefferson, those guys, they knew slavery was rotten, but they also knew they couldn't just snap their fingers and get rid of it. So they kicked the can down the road. They were like, yeah, we'll let history handle this one. Smart move, right? But history has a sense of humor. And by that, I mean history is a jerk. Case in point, Allie Whitney. This guy's like the butterfly whose wings caused the hurricane. Whitney was a Yale grad who showed up in the South in 1792 and noticed a problem. Cotton was the big cash crop, but it came with a serious bottleneck. You couldn't just pick it and use it. You had to remove the seeds first, and that was a slow, backbreaking job. A slave working 10 hours could only clean about a pound of cotton. That's it. So Whitney goes, hold my beer, and invents the cotton gin, and suddenly everything changes. Cotton production skyrockets. By 1850, the US is exporting 1 million tons of cotton to Britain every year. Not pounds, tons. But here's the dark twist. Cotton wasn't as labor intensive as other crops, which meant more people could work it: men, women, kids, even the elderly. This made slavery way more sustainable than anyone anticipated. Families of slaves could work together, live together, and get this. The enslaved population actually started to grow. By the time the Civil War rolled around, there were 4 million enslaved people in the US, with 3 million of them working in southern cotton fields. Slavery wasn't dying off, it was booming. And of course, Southern slaveholders had to start coming up with creative ways to justify it. And boy, did they get creative. First, they pulled the Great Civilizations card. They were like, all the best empires had slaves. Rome, Greece, Britain. Why not us? Then they started flipping through the Bible. Oh, look, the Apostle Paul said slaves should obey their masters. God's on our side. I mean, really. But wait, it gets crazier. They even wrote poems about how great slavery was. I'm not kidding. There's one that goes on about how northern factory workers are starving, overworked, and miserable, while southern slaves are living the dream: free housing, steady jobs, no layoffs. And if you were a struggling northern laborer, barely scraping by, you might have read that and gone, they've got a point. By the 1860s, Southern slaveholders had managed to convince themselves that slavery wasn't just necessary, it was moral, even progressive. But here's the thing: if they were so confident, why did they ban abolitionist ideas from being spread in the South? Because deep down, they knew their arguments didn't hold water. So here's the thing: if the work is ridiculously hard, like backbreaking physical labor, do you think slaves are just gonna happily do it? Of course not. They're either gonna rebel or find a way to slack off that makes managing slaves really expensive and, honestly, kind of a hassle. And that's why a lot of people back then thought slavery would eventually fade out on its own. The system wasn't sustainable. But then along came cotton, a game changer. Cotton wasn't backbreaking work. Men, women, kids, grandparents, everyone could do it. And you know what that meant. Slaves could settle down, form families, have kids. Now imagine this: you're an enslaved man, and yeah, you're pissed at the world. But you've got a wife, kids, may be some elderly parents depending on you. Are you really gonna risk everything by rebelling? Probably not. And that's how slavery got even more entrenched. By the time the Civil War rolled around, the number of enslaved people in the US had exploded to 4 million, with 3 million of them working the cotton fields in the Deep South. Slavery wasn't dying, it was thriving. And why? Because the South's economy was basically one giant cotton plantation, and cotton, that ran on slave labor. Now, here's where things get really twisted. The South knew this wasn't a good look. Owning people isn't exactly what you'd call a moral high ground. So, what do you do when you're doing something you know is wrong, but you can't or won't stop? You justify it. You come up with reasons, excuses, anything to make yourself feel better. People do this all the time, right? Like in a natural disaster, when one guy bolts out of the building without helping anyone. What does he say afterward? Oh, I ran to get help. I had to make sure I could assist others from the outside. Yeah, sure, buddy. Slaveholders did the same thing. They cooked up all kinds of reasons why slavery was not just acceptable, but actually necessary. My favorite: all the great empires had slaves: Rome, Greece, even the British Empire, as if that makes it okay. And then there's the religious argument. The Bible says everyone is equal, right? But wait, look here. The Apostle Paul told slaves to obey their masters. So, checkmate, abolitionists. I mean, come on. That's like saying speeding is fine because Jesus never explicitly mentioned speed limits. And it didn't stop there. Oh no, it gets better. Some Southern intellectuals even started comparing slavery to Northern factory work. They'd write these ridiculous poems like the Song of the Free Laborer. I'm not making this up. The poem would go on about how Northern factory workers were basically starving to death, overworked, underpaid, and living in squalor. Meanwhile, Southern slaves, oh, they had it great. They were trained by their kind and wise masters, given steady jobs, cared for when sick, and they never had to worry about unemployment. It's like, who wouldn't want this life, right? Now, here's the thing. If you were some poor, struggling factory worker up north, barely scraping by, maybe going a day or two without food, you might look at this and go, wait a second, those southern slaves might actually have it better than me. And that's exactly what the southern slaveholders wanted you to think. They were out there saying, see, slavery isn't just good, it's progressive, it's absurd, but you gotta give them credit for the creativity. By the time the Civil War was on the horizon, this kind of thinking had taken over in the South. People were standing up in public and saying, you know what? We don't have to feel guilty about slavery anymore. In fact, we're proud of it. Some even claimed that by the start of the war, most Southerners didn't feel ashamed of slavery at all. But let's not kid ourselves. They knew, deep down, they knew. How do we know they knew? Because they went out of their way to ban abolitionist ideas from spreading in the South. Think about it. If you're so confident you're in the right, why not let the other side speak? Why not have the debate? You only shut down the conversation when you're scared you might lose it. That's human nature. You can build as many fancy arguments as you want, but deep down, something in the back of your brain is still whispering, this ain't it, Chief. So, here's the deal. Back in the day, the South wasn't exactly eager to let the North's abolitionist ideas trickle down to their neighborhoods. They put up walls, metaphorical ones, not literal. They banned abolitionist books, speeches, anything that even hinted at anti slavery. And honestly, doesn't that kind of give the game away? If you're so sure you're right, why not let people debate it? Why not let the ideas flow? You afraid someone's gonna change their mind? That's like a restaurant saying, poor food is amazing, but don't eat anywhere else because, reasons. Deep down, they knew. They knew slavery wasn't defensible. You can pile up all the justifications you want, but there's that little voice in the back of your head whispering, this ain't it, Chief. And let's be real. If the system was so great, why were enslaved people bolting at the first chance they got? Why were they risking their lives to escape? I mean, you ever heard of a slave going, oh no, please don't free me. I was really looking forward to another season in the cotton fields. Yeah, me neither. But here's the thing. Just pointing out how morally bankrupt slavery was doesn't explain why the Civil War happened. Because let's be honest, if this were just about morality, you think they'd kill 620,000 people over it. No way. The real spark, that moral superiority complex up north. Ever since the American Revolution, Northerners had this vibe going. We're better than you South. We don't have slaves. We respect equality. were morally superior. And sure, a lot of them kept it verbal, condescending but non violent. Others, oh, they went all in. They were dragging Southerners to court over fugitive slaves, filing lawsuits just to make a point. It wasn't even about winning the cases, it was about embarrassing the South in public. Oh, you want to defend your property in court? Good. Let's have a national conversation about how gross you are. Ah, and then there were the real action heroes. These folks set up underground railroads, smuggled slaves to freedom, and made it their life's mission to piss off every southern plantation owner. To the South, this wasn't just moral grandstanding, this was theft, human theft. And let me tell you, slaves weren't cheap. You think it's easy to replace an enslaved person? Hell no, they were expensive. And then came John Brown. Oh boy, John Brown. This guy was like, forget lawsuits and sneaky rescues. Let's blow some stuff up. So, in 1858, he marches into the South, takes over an armory, kills a few people, and goes, all right, slaves, rise up, revolution time. Southerners, they were losing their damn minds. To them, this wasn't just some guy with a moral superiority complex. This was a maniac trying to turn their world upside down. Now, let's try to understand where the South was coming from, because from today's perspective, their whole vibe feels nuts. But back then, they had laws. They had a constitution that said slavery was legal. And yeah, they knew it was morally shaky, but legally, they were in the clear. That's why they were like, look, we're not saying slavery's perfect, but it's allowed. So why can't you just leave us alone? It's kinda like, okay, picture this. In some countries, people eat dog meat. Yeah, I know. It's a touchy subject, but stay with me. Legally, they're allowed to do it. They're sitting in their homes, enjoying their dog meat stew. And then you've got dog lovers banging on their doors, screaming, you monsters. Dogs are man's best friend. And these dog eaters are like, I'm just eating dinner. Why are you on my lawn? Now imagine some dog lovers don't stop at yelling. They start smashing windows, stealing the stew pot, maybe even punching a few people. Suddenly, it's not about what's right or wrong. It's about people feeling attacked in their own homes. And what's the first thought? Fine, I'll leave. I don't need this crap. You do? I'll go somewhere else. That's exactly how the South felt. They were like, you Northerners think you're so high and mighty. Fine, we'll secede. You live your virtuous abolitionist lives and we'll do our thing. Bye, Felicia. So, South Carolina was the first to say, we're out. They're looking at the Union like a bad roommate situation. I don't need this. I'll live on my own. Thank you very much. And honestly, Lincoln's election was the final straw. You see, not one single southern state voted for the guy. Zero nada. Zilch. He was elected purely by the North. So the South was like, this guy isn't our president. He's their president. Why should we listen to him? Now here's where it gets awkward. In those 3 months between Lincoln getting elected and actually moving into the White House, the South wasted no time. They went ahead and picked their own president, Jefferson Davis. Fun fact, Davis was from Kentucky, just like Lincoln. In fact, these two guys looked eerily similar, same state, same stoic faces, different vibes. By the time Lincoln was sworn in, Davis had already been running the Confederate show. It wasn't a country falling apart, it was two countries. Now imagine you're Lincoln. You've just stepped into office, and boom, problem number one, half the country just walked out. And Lincoln, oh, he's a hardcore unionist. The guy believed in keeping the United States together like some people believe in never splitting the bill. But here's the kicker, he wasn't some die-hard abolitionist. Sure, morally, he thought slavery sucked. But legally, he knew the Constitution didn't give him the power to just end it. What Lincoln could do, though, was whip out this legal Hail Mary. He said, leaving the Union, that's treason. And treason, my friends, was Lincoln's line in the sand. You're not leaving, he said. You're coming back, even if I have to drag you. Now, here's the twist, Lincoln wasn't being a bully. He wasn't like, hey South, I'm gonna kick your ass. He was more like, look, legally, I respect your rights. I'm not out here to take your slaves. But I also can't stop those feisty Northerners, your John Browns, your Underground Railroads, from giving you grief. So, yeah, good luck with that. But even all of this tension wasn't enough to trigger a war just yet. You know what tipped the scale? Virginia. Oh, sweet, sweet Virginia. Now, Virginia actually means virgin. Yes, that kind of virgin. And fittingly, this state was known for its pure ideals and its lofty sense of principles. Virginia was like, we are America's conscience. I mean, this is the state that gave us Washington, Jefferson, and a whopping 8 US presidents. They were basically the founding fathers' clubhouse. Virginia's whole deal wasn't about being loyal to the United States as a country. It was about being loyal to the principles of the United States. Independence, freedom, the right to live your life how you want. That's what Virginia stood for. But here's the irony, Virginia was a slave state. Yep, awkward. And yet, there were loud voices within the state saying, you know what? We should really get rid of this slavery thing. Honestly, if history had just given Virginia a little more time, they probably would have abolished slavery on their own. In fact, they were so split on the issue that during the Civil War, the state literally broke in half. West Virginia was like, we're out, we're going north. But in 1860, Virginia still had to pick a side, and their stance was surprisingly clear. We hate slavery, we love America, and we're against South Carolina and Georgia leaving the Union. But, oh, there's always a but. Here's where it gets spicy. Virginia said if the North uses military force to bring those states back, nope. We're joining the South, and that's what Virginia did. Not to defend slavery, not to fight for plantation owners, but to fight for what they believed were the core American values: freedom, independence, and not letting the federal government bully states around. In Virginia's mind, they weren't betraying America, they were defending the America their heroes, Washington and Jefferson, had built. Let's talk about Robert E. Yeah, that Robert E. Lee, the guy who's still held in pretty high regard by a lot of Americans today. And let me tell you, his story is one big, complicated mess of contradictions. First off, Lee was a staunch opponent of slavery. Yep, anti slavery. He was also a Unionist who thought the South shouldn't secede from the North. So naturally, what does this guy do? He becomes the top general for the Confederacy. Makes perfect sense, right? Here's the deal, Robert E. Lee wasn't just good at his job, he was phenomenal. He was so good that, when the Civil War started, Lincoln himself went to Lee and said, hey, want to be the commander of the Union Army. And you know what Lee said? Hold up, I need to check on Virginia first, because I'm a Virginian, and there is no way I'm leading an army to attack my home state, my friends, my family, my neighbors. That's a no-go. And right there, you see the real issue. Back then, Americans didn't see their primary identity as being part of a country. No, sir. Their number one loyalty was to their state. And state didn't just mean a place with DMV offices and state fairs. It was like a mini country. The United States wasn't even really a single nation. It was a federation of these tiny, proud little countries, all doing their own thing. So, for Lee, Virginia came first. When Virginia said, "We're joining the Confederacy," Lee was like, "Well, guess I'm heading south." But now, when we dig into Lee's story, it becomes this perfect little microcosm of the whole Civil War. Why it started, why it got so messy, and why it's still such a debated topic. You had people on both sides with their own moral arguments, legal justifications, and deep seated convictions. And after years of conflict building up by 1860, it all just hit a breaking point. Boom. War. And if you want to understand the psychology of this thing, I've got the perfect metaphor. Imagine there's a guy in your neighborhood who loves eating dog meat. Like, he's grilling it every weekend. Now, the other neighbors are furious. They're standing on his lawn, yelling at him, "You monster! Dogs are man's best friend." And this guy, he's just there like, "What? I'm just trying to enjoy my BBQ. Eventually, the guy can't take it anymore. He says, "Fine, I'm moving out of this neighborhood." But the neighbors are like, "Oh, no, you're not. We're a community. You don't just get to leave because we disapprove of your lifestyle." Now, imagine that Choi president, the guy who doesn't even eat dog meat, steps in and says, "Well, technically, you're not allowed to stop someone from moving out. That's a violation of their rights." So, yeah, I'm siding with dog BBQ guy. What happens next? Chaos. A fistfight breaks out, and guess who gets beaten up the worst? The HOA president. That's Virginia in the Civil War, a state trying to stand by its principles but ending up taking the heaviest hits. Now, if you look at this from the Southern perspective, they didn't think they were the bad guys. Far from it. They felt they were the ones fighting for their way of life, for their home, for their freedom. And yeah, I know you're thinking, freedom. Seriously, the whole thing was about slavery. But here's the nuance: less than 5% of Southerners actually owned slaves. So, why were all these regular guys fighting and dying for a system that didn't directly benefit them? Because in their eyes, this wasn't just about slavery, it was about defending their homeland. They weren't dying for plantation owners, they were dying for their families, their communities, and what they saw as their right to live the way they wanted to live. It's messy, it's emotional, it's human, and that's what made this war such a tragedy. So, picture this: the South marches into the Civil War like they're hoisting this giant, fluttering banner that says, "We've got the moral high ground." They're all fired up, thinking, "We're fighting for freedom, for our homes, for our way of life." And you know what? They really believed it. But here's the cold, hard truth about history: it doesn't care who's right. It cares who's got the bigger stick. And spoiler alert, the North stick, oh, it was massive. Let me hit you with some numbers. The North's industrial output, 10 times that of the South. 10 times. The North was cranking out 1.5 billion worth of goods, while the South was over here struggling with the 150 million. The North had 1.3 million factory workers. The South, 11,000. That's like trying to win a football game with 5 guys against a whole NFL roster. Now, the South didn't have factories, but they had something else, a grit. A whole lot of it. They had this proud, deep-rooted martial culture. Like, they were ready to throw down at the drop of a hat. And here's the kicker, the South had 5 times as many military academies as the North. 5 times. So while the North's generals were like, where's the battlefield? Southern commanders like Robert E. Lee were out there drawing plays like they were inventing chess moves. Here's the wild part in almost every battle. Even when the South lost, they managed to kill more Union soldiers. Tactically, these guys were on another level. But that didn't matter, because the North had one unbeatable advantage: sheer numbers. It's like playing chess, and every time you lose a piece, the other guy just pulls another rook out of his back pocket. Doesn't matter how good you are, eventually you're gonna run out of pieces. The North figured this out pretty quick. Their strategy: just outlast the South. They'd go, "Oh, you're brilliant tacticians. Cool. We'll grind you down. Let's see how long you can keep this up." And that's when the North went scorched earth. General Ulysses S. Grant, the guy practically invented modern total war. You know, the whole burn it all down philosophy. That's Grant's playbook. Then you've got General Sherman, who famously said, "War is hell." And boy, did he mean it. Sherman's philosophy was simple. If it helps the South keep fighting, burn it, destroy it, take it out. Didn't matter if it was food, railroads, or grandma's rocking chair. It all had to go. Now here's the thing. The North didn't go around slaughtering civilians. They weren't barbarians. This was still a war between Americans. But property. Oh, they wrecked that stuff like a bull in a china shop. Sherman once said, "This isn't just about fighting armies. This is a war against people. If we don't strip them of their ability to wage war, this thing's never gonna end." But let's rewind for a second. At the start of the war, the North was cocky as hell. They were like, "We've got the factories, we've got the railroads, we've got the numbers. Let's wrap this up by lunch." The capitals. They were practically neighbors. Washington, D.C. and Richmond were only 170 kilometers apart. That's less than a 2-hour drive today. The Union figured, we'll just march down there, take Richmond, grab Jefferson Davis, and call it a day. Lincoln's first call for troops. He asked for 75,000 men for 3 months. That's how confident he was. But, oh man, did reality hit them like a freight train. The first time Union troops marched south, Washington residents thought it was gonna be a fun day trip. Families packed picnic baskets, brought the kids, and literally went out to watch the battle like it was a football game. They're on the sidelines like, "Go Union, show those rebels who's boss." And then, 30 miles south of D.C., the Union troops got their butts handed to them. The South came at them with everything they had. Those picnickers. They weren't cheering anymore. They were running back to their carriages like, "Honey, grab the kids. We're getting out of here." It was a disaster. And that's the thing about war. You think it's gonna be quick, clean, and over in no time. But once you let that beast out of the bottle, it's got a life of its own. Lincoln couldn't have known this war would last 5 years and kill over 600,000 people. If he had, he might have thought twice about the whole thing. But that's war for you. It's chaos, it's brutal, and once it starts, good luck putting it back in the box. Here we are, civil war raging, Americans who'd been chilling in peace for decades suddenly hear the cannon fire, see the bloodshed, and go, oh my god, this is a disaster. Northern troops are getting absolutely wrecked in those early battles, running home like they just saw a ghost. And from that point on, this war was a runaway train. Unstoppable, messy, tragic. But here's the thing about the Civil War. What makes it so fascinating isn't just the bloodshed or the drama. No, it's how it ended. Let me set the stage. The South loses. Robert E. Lee hands over his sword to Ulysses S. Grant, signaling the Confederacy's surrender. And then what happens? Trials for war crimes, executions. Nope, none of that. Here's what went down, everybody: soldiers, commanders, everyone just packed up and went home. No prison sentences, no firing squads, no gallows. They went back to their farms, their towns, and just started living their lives again. Even Robert E. Lee, the South's main guy, ends up becoming the president of Washington College, which today is literally called Washington and Lee University. The guy pivoted from war hero to college administrator like he was updating his LinkedIn. Now, you gotta ask why. Why was there no punishment? Well, the answer is Lincoln. That's right, Abraham Lincoln, Honest Abe Mr. Tall Hat himself, said, no, we're not doing this vengeance thing. Lincoln knew America had been through enough. Brother fighting brother, homes burned to the ground, over 600,000 people dead. He wasn't about to pile more division on top of that mess. What the country needed was healing, fusion, not fission. And let me tell you, when Lincoln was assassinated, the people most relieved weren't the former Confederate leaders. Nope. It was the Northern hardliners who'd been itching to crack down on the South. You know, the punish them all crowd. These guys probably popped champagne when they heard the news, thinking, finally, we can show those rebels what's what. But Lincoln, he knew better. He understood that America couldn't move forward if it stayed trapped in cycles of revenge. The Civil War wasn't about one side's truth conquering the other. It wasn't some cinematic moment where truth emerges from the blood soaked battlefield, triumphant and shining. No, this war ended with two sides agreeing to shove their truths together into one messy, uncomfortable compromise. A little bit of their truth, a little bit of ours, and let's figure out how to live under the same roof again. Now, let's talk about Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. This speech is iconic now, but back then, people thought it was a joke. You gotta understand, when Lincoln showed up to Gettysburg a few months after the Union's victory there, the crowd was ready for a show. The guy before Lincoln gave this massive 2 hour speech. 2 hours. That's like binge. Watching an entire Netflix season in one sitting. He was going all in, talking about the fallen soldiers, the glory of the Union, the evil of the enemy. Just really milking it. Then Lincoln steps up. People are thinking, here we go. The main act. Another 2 hour banger? Instead, Lincoln speaks for 2 minutes. Two, it was over before half the audience even stopped talking. People were confused. Some of them laughed like, that's it. That's your speech. But Lincoln wasn't there to ramble on about specifics. He skipped right past all that and hit the big ideas, the foundations. That's where you get those three immortal phrases of the people, by the people, for the people. Boom, mic drop. 2 minutes, and he rewrote American political philosophy. The genius of Lincoln's speech is this: it wasn't about celebrating a Union victory or rubbing it in the South's face. It was about redefining what the United States could be. It said, yeah, we just had the most brutal family fight in history, but we're not tearing the house down. We're figuring out how to live together. Bah! That's the real legacy of the Civil War. It's not about who was right or who won. It's about what came after. The recognition that if we're gonna make this thing work, we've gotta decide together on the rules of the game. That's what makes the war and Lincoln's leadership so extraordinary.